We're honored today to have as our guest Vache Gabrielyan, the Dean of the Manoogian Simone College of Business and Economics at AUA, former Deputy Prime Minister and former Finance Minister of Armenia. It's a pleasure having you on our show, Mr. Gabrielyan.
Thank you. It's my pleasure being here.
Today we had the 11th-month release of the economic data. Obviously, the reason we have you here is to go over these numbers. So I want to give you a chance to explain to our public what we're looking at. Obviously, we're in a worldwide recession. In certain places, you can call it a depression. Can you explain where we're at in our current situation and what you see in these numbers?
Well, cumulatively, we have about 7.2% of decline over 11 months. And over the year, I expect our decline being more for a couple of reasons. Most important reason is the economic base of it. If you looked at the economic growth patterns of 2019, the most growth that happened was in December. And November and December, the last 2 months, were the most important ones. If you are looking also, the numbers from agriculture are not factored in the last report because it's coming quarterly. If we are looking at the quarterly data for agriculture that were released earlier, we have a growth in the first quarter, even status in the second quarter, and about 3% loss in the third quarter. But if you look cumulatively at the numbers, the first quarter usually produces twice as much as the first 2 quarters together. So the likelihood that we are going to end up in agriculture as well is very low. Most likely it is going to be -1, 2% or plus something, but again, we are not expecting to see huge growth numbers there. The largest sector of the economy is services, and the pattern that we see in the services, we are not seeing too much growth either, because if we see again numbers today came out cumulatively, we are 88% in construction, 86% in trade turnover, and services without trade is again 86%. And in November, if we compare to last November, the trade volume is 78%, and the services volume is 81%.
This is the foreign trade volume, you said?
No,
Just in purchases and sales.
Purchases and sales. So as a result, what is going to happen? We are going to have a similar pattern also in December. And we have to remember also that in December last year, there was this big inflow of foreign cars that were exploiting the loophole, and a lot of Russians and Kazakhs were coming, buying, and there is a lot of stock still of foreign cars that were brought in order to sell to the countries because of this loophole of Armenian succession to Eurasian Economic Union. So as a result, we are not going to have neither the sales volumes, nor there is going to be extraordinary celebrations of Christmases, New Year, given the situation in Armenia. As a result, we are not going to expect it going more. And on the base of last year's, it is going. So in my understanding, given these factors, what we are going to do, we are going to have another decline in around 10% range also in December, which is going to cumulatively bring total loss more than 8%. There is also an issue with mining, because one of the major mines, Sotk, which is gold mine, problematic. And just to give you numbers, that in the first 3 quarters, the exports of $44 million were in gold. So this is also going to have impact on foreign trade, etc. So my estimate initially was 9 to 10%. I may be wrong on 1%. I think it's going to be 8 to 9%.
Looking at this, obviously we've had the world economy as a whole has been hit by COVID. and that's universal. Except in one or two places where China has handled it, I think they even have minor growth this year. For the most part, it's been devastated to the world economy. On top of that, we've had the war. To what extent would you attribute the decline to COVID? To what extent would you attribute the decline to the war? And how do we compare to other similar countries in declines? Because obviously this economic decline is worldwide. It's not just particularly to us. We're just impacted by it. You know, we've just had a double impact on it rather than a single impact like most of the world.
I think most of it is due to COVID. Of course, there is also a war situation, particularly if we are going to talk about mining industry. In December and November, it is going to be because of war and this small thing, but we have to take into account that the actual driver in this year, because of the decline, was actually the mining. If we hadn't the mining industry growing very large, at very high speed, we are not going to have even these rates. For example, extraction of molybdenum was 6 times more. The only industry that we had productivity growth was in a mining industry, etc. But if to come up with numbers, number-wise, only China is expected to show up growth up to 2%. If we are taking Europe, on average, it is going to be 7 to 8%. In the United States, it's going to be 4% of loss. In Great Britain, it's going to be about 11.5, etc. But if we are looking at developed countries, their pattern is expected to be a V-shaped recovery, because as soon as the vaccine comes up, they are going to be vaccinated fast. They are more, they are richer countries. It's going to be more affordable. They have more established healthcare system. They could address it in a better way. It is expected that in developing world, it's going to be more like L-shaped. If you are looking at trade partners type of thing, or close by economies, say Turkey and Russia is a partner, Turkey is not a partner, of course. They have about 3 to 4% decline estimated that is going to be over. Georgia is going to have around 6, at least their October numbers were 5.6 or so. So we are outperforming the developing world, underperforming the developed world most of the time, and it's understandable because most of the developed world has larger service sector. And because of the restrictions, especially service sector is suffering. And because of that, also the recovery is going to become faster because service sector is going to...
It's easier to recover rather than industry. One thing, obviously, every country has its, you've done an excellent job of outlining the problems of where we're at. Different countries have different capacities in having local policies to affect, to encourage growth or to sort of reverse these negative aspects. Obviously, we don't have the ability like the United States to print money, fiat money. And any government, whether this one or any other, would have limited options in what it can do. But if you were going to give concrete advice on things that can be done, that can improve these numbers, no matter how difficult the situation is, what would be your policy proposals, 2 or 3, not simple things, but 2 or 3 broad things that the government can do, whether that's stimulus spending to a certain extent, whether you borrow and you spend more to stimulate the economy. What would it be? What would be your advice? What is it, given the limitations of the world economy and the limitations of the size of our economy and budget, what are the policies that you would recommend for the next 6 months to be able to reverse some of this?
Well, it's very hard to reverse because the most successful countries are those who had infrastructures ready for that. And it's a very interesting case if you are looking at the OECD countries. There was a recent study from McKinsey, very interesting one. that the countries with smaller public sector have spent much more than the countries with larger public sector. And their stimulus packages of smaller governments have been larger. So they theorize that it is a new type of social contract evolving, and at least at an emergency case, the governments responded with far larger stimulus. And the numbers are quite staggering, because if you are looking at these OECD numbers, there are 3 times more stimulus has gone than during the financial crisis, and several times more than the Marshall Plan. So it's kind of one-of-a-kind thing that never ever before there was such a coordinated response to such a in such a small time. But it is due to certain developments. For example, if we are going to look at how the countries responded to COVID, I'm talking about public health-wise. The countries that responded to it very fast, efficient, and did know how to do were the Asian countries. But it was not only the case that Asian countries are autocratic, I don't know, are more centralized surveillance, etc., etc. It was that they had been recently hit by SARS.
Yeah.
And as a result, they developed routines and they developed practices. So if they were to start from scratch and they were to start tracing people, they couldn't have done so. But already there was basic infrastructure of people, tests, labs, surveillance tools, etc. And for example, for that reason, Koreans responded very well. Similarly, if we are talking to the United States now have internalized the lessons that they had to be more active, and like the Fed is active, and Bernanke laid the foundations of more activist Fed, and Powell is doing that. If somebody was told 10 years ago that the Fed is going to be this activist, they would say you are out of your mind and you are crazy. Because the type of stimulus that they are doing, absolutely flooding money with everything, the Main Street directly, not through the intermediaries, etc., giving cash, go and spend this and that, it's not being without preparation. And
it's like helicopter money. Right?
Yeah, but this helicopter money was, groundwork was laid out after Bernanke's activism, Yellen's continuing it up, keeping it too low for a long time, understanding that if you don't push money, it's not going to work that way. So unfortunately, we didn't have that type of infrastructure, because this is a different type of crisis that happened in 2009. Why it's different? Because this is mostly social assistance. There is no malfunctioning of industries, banks, financial system. There is no payment arrears, nothing of that sort. There are suddenly people who are out of work. Now, you had to keep them in the workforce. Some countries, the government did most of the stimulus. In my understanding, in this country, most of the stimulus have been done by the business. Because the government pushed for mostly banking sector, channeling it through banking sector, and not directly paying. Even if they were directly paying, they were not paying upfront, but they were waiting until the expenses would accrue and then they would compensate. It was a very parsimonious approach. But this parsimonious approach is problematic in my opinion, and I was arguing at that time, from the public health perspective, because it's not cease and desist. It is, okay, let's see what is happening. If you have a problem, we are going to address it. It's parsimonious from the perspective of finance, but not very parsimonious from perspective of keeping up the economic quality. But it is a moment that was missed. Now what we are going to do, we are going to understand that still most of the service industry is not going to be very functional during the first half of the year. Yes, the vaccines are there. Yes, we are going to get some. But first of all, there are no enough vaccines for a whole population. If you are going to get vaccines, and it's not something that you can overpay being a small country and poor country, you are going to get some through general distribution of or WHO or others, you can get some separate agreements with some producers, but in any case, most of all, you are going to use it to vaccinate people who are at risk, who are our frontline people.
Medical staff, older people, etc. So this means that the likelihood that your services industry is going to pick up is not very large one. Second, even if you are going to administer it, it is going to take time, and it's still you are going to keep the regime of social distancing, different type of interactions, etc. So the most likely part, in my understanding, that we are going to keep up steam and the economy starts rolling again, etc., is going to come in 2021, closer to fall, which is the first part of the year is not going to be significantly different. The IMF has been given an estimate of our growth for next year only 1%. Under 1%.
Under 1%.
Yeah. Which is essentially no growth.
Essentially no growth, and their estimate of loss for this year is 7%. So what we are going to see, there is another issue that we are going to have to issue a lot of debt. But also in this debt, the question is what our priorities are and what the priorities should be. A, for growth, B, for social cases. Now the question is that if you look at the budget numbers, in 2020, there was high spirits, gung-ho approach, growth was phenomenal, although it was aided by a lot of foreign cars coming and going, there were a lot of revenues coming. The budgetary expenditures, current expenditures, not capital ones, have been increased significantly. For example, about quarter have been increased, the health increases, there were wage increases, etc., etc. Now, most of it is unsustainable because currently, if we are going to take as an approach that we are going to grow only about 1% in 2021, we are going to be at the level of 2018, beginning 2017. And at that time, we didn't have this social package. And we are not going to have higher growth rates in 2021. We are not going to see V-shaped recovery because we have fundamental problems of war. And particularly about safety and security, which is going to guarantee your investments. What we should aim at immediately is having a significant effort on securing the believable for the economic agents infrastructure and environment that they believe that this is something safe and we are going to invest here. And if we are going
just to interrupt you, you're saying that reaching a political settlement on, especially on security issues, is key for future growth.
Absolutely. See, just to give numbers, the only industry that grew this year, productivity grew, and the locomotive of whatever was happening was mining industry. Where is mining industry? Mostly Zangezur, Vapan, etc. That's the only region of Armenia where we had smaller than average, almost non-existent migrant workers getting out to work in Russia was there. Because they had higher than average wages compared to lower than average skills. And all of this was due to mining. Now imagine that you are not going to have ironclad security in Zangezur. What is going to happen? So in my understanding, you have to cut down to the extent possible all the current expenditures, add-ons or something, and go and do infrastructures in Syunik. And the infrastructures, border stations, roads, roads, electricity, water, whatever. But for the next 5 years, we are given a priority, and it's called CivilNet.
Yeah, it makes sense. You already dealt with government debt. One of the issues, obviously, is the dram issue. The dram, since the war, has depreciated somewhere in the 4 to 5% range. I don't know what the exact number is. I think it was 485 to 520, somewhere in that. Maybe it's a little bit less than that. What do you see? I have a short-term specific question, which is, where do you see the dram going this year, as far as the window? But my second question is more universal, which is something that's always somewhat surprised me. This is through 20, 25 years, compared to the dram has been relatively stable currency. It sort of had a bandwidth of like 20% either way. What explains that, in the universal scheme, what explains that consistency of this very stable currency, given the fact that our economy has hardly ever been very strong in all those years, especially compared to our neighboring countries that have had tremendous devaluations for many different reasons. Iran is a completely different case, but Turkey, Georgia, and obviously Azerbaijan also. So in the short run, where do you see the dram going this year? And on the long run, for the purposes of our historical look at the currency, what explains its relative stability compared to other countries around us?
Well, if you are going to look at the short run, we have to see what has been the response to this crisis. And the response to this crisis was a very similar one that happened, for example, in 2015. In 2015, we had a strong shock coming from Russian economic crisis when ruble has halved, and there were problems of selling our products, mostly produce, etc. Also food, canned food, many other things. But also it cheapened imports. And actually, if you looked at what happened, we started to import much more from Russia, not because we became members of Eurasian Economic Union, because it became twice as cheaper. No. So the other thing also helped, but the most important thing was that. So it was a similar thing that we had this year. By about 14%, we had retraction in imports and about 6% in exports. Exports is understandable because if you are looking where you were trading at, Russian economy is not doing as well, etc. What you cannot sell that much. But we're selling a lot of ore, particularly copper, molybdenum, and gold. So if this trade is going to continue, we are not going to, if this trend is going to continue, we are not going to import again more extravagant things. We are going to cut down. And we were importing last year and exporting again cars. There was a lot of through traffic. So what we are going to do, we are going to cut down imports. This is the traditional reaction to these events. And we are going to have some problems, I think, with mining because of SOTK, because I don't know exactly how that's going to play out. And it's from this perspective, I would see a little bit more pressure on dram, but I don't see dram coalescing around in big oscillations. So I wouldn't think that it is going to be very hard. I would think maybe perhaps within 10% range, or overall it will bring it 20, but nothing is given because, again, the ability to contract spending and import is much stronger.
So now, what about my universal question about over the 20, 25 years, or the currency is almost 30 years old, compared to our neighboring countries, some of them have much better economic prospects. What explains the stability of the dram historically compared to some of these other currencies?
Well, I think to a certain extent it was more sound macroeconomic policies. we have a relatively established central bank as opposed to many other government institutions. There was also very close cooperation with the International Monetary Fund, etc., which was keeping kind of the monetary policy, fiscal policy, macroeconomic framework not getting out of hand, so the signaling was not, of rampant spending was not there. And until recently we didn't have populist governments. So as a result of it, this actually happened.
We've talked, most of the conversations we have now tend to be pessimistic just because it's the nature of our times. But I want to ask a more of a future-oriented question. Obviously, prior to all these two disasters, there were certain bright spots in our economy, historically. I mean, it's things that have developed over the years. It really has nothing tied to do with this regime or this government, that government. And we know some of them. And we have a pretty robust service sector. It's actually pretty good in certain levels, is exceptional. We have a very good banking sector. And we have a good, generally good IT sector that has shown consistent growth over the years. What would your approach be? Obviously, I would think that when something works, you want to double down on it. And you sort of want to accelerate it. Do you see the same things I'm seeing as our strength? And if that's the case, how would you focus on improving each or doubling down on each for the purposes of the long-term future, not the next year or two, just as a systematic approach?
Well, my sincere belief is that usually government functions are those of maintaining, upgrading infrastructures. So let's look at what we can do in order to maintain and upgrade infrastructures for that reason. If we are to look at, for example, the IT sector, the bottleneck is education.
So by infrastructure, you don't necessarily mean just roads, and you're talking about human infrastructure, human capital.
Human capital, but in order to have this thing, we are going to have one of the things with education and workforce. If you just bring up the best professors in IT, it doesn't mean you are going to have that many people applying. You have to do much deeper work, and also you have to make these jobs relevant and these jobs earning power. And you have to understand that we are also not only after the jobs that are only the highest paying, but stable, good, less volatile, but still good earning jobs. If you are looking at the country, on average, our wage is about
high $300,000, right? Close to $350 to $400.
Yes, about $350. It's $180,000, but this is the average one. Yeah. The median is much less. It's $120,000, which is about.
What's the difference between the median and the average for our average viewer?
Okay.
How would you explain that?
Average is the mean arithmetic for the.
Because there's people making $3,000 a month.
And it is skewing to the right. Median is the middle guy. Usually, if you are talking in many other countries, they are talking about median. Okay. Median household, median income, etc. So what do we call, say, the average wage and the wage of an average guy? The wage of an average guy is about $120, which is the real price of the workforce. Not in the industries like IT, but
120,000 drams, not
yes.
$120.
Yes, 120,000 drams, which is
$200.
Coming around $200.
A little over $200.
220 or something like that. So we have to look at the jobs that are slightly above it and at that type of jobs, because it is very difficult in an economy that is centered around $250 to create jobs in thousands that are earning $5,000. Usually that doesn't happen, because if these people are there and who can earn that much money, the likelihood that they are going to vote with their feet to greener pastures is much larger. So from this perspective, it's very interesting. I am not going to advocate too much that we have to do only kind of pure IT and high flight IT. But instead we have to have the environment of it, engineering structures, R&Ds, people who supply this, so the ecosystem around that industry that is going to help them. It will both create jobs for the local people, because a lot of IT people are working on outside. I know people who are getting the job from the internet. They don't know who their employer is. They complete the work, they send it, and they get money.
Yeah, no, I know firms here that 70–80% of their work is but abroad, all of it.
So what we have to do, we have not only to try to export that much. Export is good. Actually, we have to strive for export, but also we have to try to create infrastructure around it of jobs that are supporting it and creating not only jobs that cater to it, but jobs that support to it.
Sort of middle class jobs, essentially.
Yes. So this is extremely important to go that way. And to a certain extent, service industry came to cater these high earners and tourists. And we are going to have tourists again. It's going to rebound. It's not that we are never going to have them. But we have to think about these middle level jobs much more.
Well, I mean, one of the things about tourism is in the context of the West, tourism jobs are low-paying jobs. In the context of countries like Armenia, tourism jobs are actually high-paying jobs, or relatively middle to high-paying jobs. I think the last question that I'll leave you with is the X factor of tourism. If you have, as you stated, most of our tourists come from more advanced countries, generally, for the most part. If you have a quicker recovery, sort of a medical recovery in these countries, do you think our tourism sector might actually kickstart a little bit earlier, then we can see some of this impact more positively this summer than otherwise?
Not really, because it's not only about their country, it's about our country being perceived as safe.
Okay.
Because if an American or Belgian or whoever who would like to come here, but he knows or she knows that if they go back, they are going to spend a week in quarantine and then they don't have a vaccine, then they are going to think twice to come here, or more vaccinated country, which is going to be, for example, Germany. So from this perspective, this is again about infrastructure, how to roll out vaccination fast, how to find out the more vulnerable and the more, not vulnerable, but dangerous people. Dangerous not in terms of...
Yeah, but dangerous to themselves.
Well, yeah. Also that they are going to spread it, and how to isolate them. There are so-called essential workers. The term the United States came to tell the people who are paid less, but have to work in more danger. And it's very interesting that the gains that these people made in wages are more than in the last 25 years in the West. Because suddenly they really became essential and they had to be paid in order to perform the functions.
They weren't essential before.
They weren't essential before, suddenly they became essential. It's very fascinating if you are looking at the job structure. In most of the countries, in Armenia as well, it's interesting. The economy is contracting by 8% or 7–8%. The jobs are growing. We have two things there.
How is that possible?
That's possible for two reasons in Armenia. But in general, it's also the case in the OECD countries. In OECD countries, it is due to temporary jobs.
Okay.
So the full-time jobs go down, middle jobs go down, high-paying jobs that you commute from anywhere and everywhere are on rise. The jobs that are so-called essentials that are on rise, the middle jobs are lost. In Armenia, we have a similar situation that high-paying jobs are there. They are also commuting and working, not commuting and working from home. And we just had a law in Armenia adopted in 2019 that started to work from 20, that actually if you are registering as a micro-enterprise and not paying taxes at all, you are not paying taxes at all, but if you paid 5,000 rams per month, you are eligible for pension. And a very interesting statistics is out there that actually on average in 2019 we had about 4,800 more enterprises created month over month.
Every month?
No.
Oh, overall, yeah.
Overall,
yeah.
Average numbers.
Yeah.
Dying. In this year we have reducing in number of public organizations, but we have large number of private organizations, more than 7,000. In year of retraction and not growth, we are having 7,200 companies created in first 10 months. But out of those 7,200, 7,150 have on average 3 employees. Wow. Which is people just registering themselves.
And the family.
But it's not even given that they are coming out of shadows. They are registering to be eligible for
their pension.
So it is both the dynamic that exists in the West because of support of temporary jobs, and this is particular dynamics here. As a result of it, if you look down and you say, okay, this was the most awful year of productivity, because in all sectors productivity plummeted except for the mining.
Wow. Well, it was very informative, not always happy, but here we're looking at the facts straight on and not blinking and thinking about solutions. I appreciate your time and I appreciate your great insights. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, it was my pleasure being here.
This is your host of CivilNet, Eric Hacopian. Thank you for joining us.